The People of Sparks, Chapter 9 Hard, Hungry Work. Instead of getting easier as the days went on, work for the people of Ember got harder. It wasn't just the work, it was the heat they had to work in. Every day was hotter than the last. Dune had never felt this warm in his life. It was like being cooked. All the people of Ember felt this way. They sweated, their skin turned red and stung and peeled off, and the brightness of the sky hurt their eyes. They got terrible headaches. Sometimes one of them would drop to the ground in a faint, just from being too hot. At times like these, people thought, "This is a dreadful place we have come to." They put their hands over their eyes, missing the familiar darkness. The team leaders tried to be understanding when their workers dropped and fainted, but the people of Sparks were used to the heat. Beside them, the people of Ember seemed like weaklings. A few times, Dune saw the leader of his team press his lips together and drum his fingers against his leg when one of the Emberites had to sit down and rest. Dune's team leader was Chugger Frisk, a big stubble-jawed man who didn't talk much except to give directions. Every day he sent his team wherever it was most needed. Dune did all kinds of jobs over the next few weeks. He dug ditches for the pipes that connected water from the river to the crops in the fields. He repaired the wagons that hauled the produce home from the fields. He milked the goats out in the goat pasture and made sure the water troughs for the oxen were full. He picked fruit, built fences, planted seeds, stirred vats of soap, and dug chicken droppings into the cabbage field. Except for being so hot, he didn't mind the work. He was getting strong and he liked being strong. He liked feeling his muscles in his arms getting harder and liked being taller. He knew he was taller because his old pants were too short. The feeling of being a new person in this new world stayed with him. He would be 13 soon, not a child anymore. Work was making him sturdy and ready for anything. Besides, as he worked, he was finding all kinds of things he wanted to learn. How did the pumps work that brought water up from the river to the fields? How was cheese made, and shoes and candles? Where did they get the ice that kept things cold in their big ice house? What were the bushy-tailed animals that scurried up trees and the long rope-like animals that he sometimes almost stepped on in the grass? He wanted to know how houses were built and what glass was made of and how bicycles worked. It was exciting having so much to learn. But every time he remembered that he and his people had less than 6 months to learn it, less than 6 months to master all the skills they needed to build a town of their own, a worm of fear twisted in his stomach. Chugger wouldn't answer questions. He was too busy giving directions or working, so Dune often asked his questions at lunch. Sometimes Ordony answered him, sometimes Martha did. Ordony's answers were more like lectures, and Martha's were more like boasts. After a while, it was clear that both of them were getting tired of questions, so Dune asked fewer of them. One day, Kinney followed him outside after lunch and stretched up to whisper in his ear. "I can show you where there's answer to your questions," he said. "Want me to?" "Sure," said Dune. "Right now?" said Kinney. "Okay," said Dune. Kinney led him through the streets of the village, going first towards the river and then away from it, along a street that led out away from the houses and into a grove of oak trees. "There," said Kinney, pointing ahead. At first Dune saw only the long line of a roof above the trees. Then the street opened out into a big empty place that, he could see, had once been covered with pavement. Now the pavement was cracked and weeds grew through it. To the left of this span of pavement stood a huge building, a rectangular structure so tremendous it could have held both the Ember School and the Gathering Hall. At the end facing them were two massive wooden doors, which Kinney walked towards. "In the ancient days," Kinney said, "you didn't have to open these. They were made of glass, and they had eyes and they opened as soon as you saw them." "That can't be," said Dune. "It was, though," Kinney said. Above the doors was a sign missing most of its letters. It was a long sign so that you could tell whatever it used to say was a long word, but now all it said was, "Up Ark." "What does that mean?" Dune asked, pointing to the sign. "I don't know," Kinney said. "We just call it the Ark. It's our storehouse. We're going around to the back." He led the way around the side of the building to a small door in the back wall, which he opened. He had to push hard because something was behind the door that had been shoved out of the way. Dune peered into the darkness. At first he couldn't make out what he was seeing. Lumpy mountains appeared to fill the room and to the ceiling and spread from wall to wall. He took a step forward, but his foot jammed to get something hard on the floor. "There's answers to everything in here," said Kinney. As his eyes adjusted to the dimness, Dune saw that the room was full of... Was it boxes? No, they almost looked like books. They lay in toppling stacks, giant heaps, sliding mounds, as if they had been dumped in an enormous bucket. Some of them lay open with their pages crumbled. Some were so warped that their covers curved. A smell of ancient dust and mold arose from them. He reached down and picked one up. Its cover was furred with dust. He opened it and saw pages of tiny, neat printing. It was a book, yes, but not like the books of Ember. These were much bigger and sturdier and had much more writing. He rifled the pages. More dust flew up, but he couldn't tell what the book was about. One page said, Chapter 15, The Thermodynamics of Aluminum. He had no idea what that meant. This is amazing, said Dune. Can I take some back to the hotel? I guess so, said Kenny. No one will notice. Dune set the book down about thermodynamics. He brushed his smudged fingers against his pants. He felt like a hungry person who had been led to an immense banquet, far more food than he could eat in his whole life. He was starving all of a sudden for the knowledge hidden in these books. He reached out and chose 3 of them blindly, not even looking at the titles. Don't you want some? He said to Kenny. No, said Kenny. I already read 4 books in school. That was enough. We learned about history pre and post. Pre and post? Pre-disaster and post-disaster. Oh, said Dune. What do you like to do then? He asked. Just poke around, said Kenny. I poke around in the woods. You could come with me sometime, he said, looking up at Dune with hopeful eyes. If you want. Maybe I will, Dune said, though he was thinking probably he wouldn't. He had so many other things to mind to do. Besides, Kenny was a little too young to be his friend. During the first week after the Emberites arrived, Martha Partridge had showed off her cooking skills at lunch every day. She made mashed potato pie, fresh peas with chives, walnut croquettes, mushroom gravy, cheese, popovers, red onion and bean dumplings, scrambled eggs with tomato jam, apricot pudding, and apple butter cookies. Every time she brought in a new dish, she said, I don't imagine you had these where you came from, or this will be new to you. And the Ember guests would say, You're right, we've never had this. We've never tasted anything so delicious. It's wonderful. And Martha's mouth would crimp into a small, pleased smile. As time went on, however, the food at lunchtime became plainer. Martha got tired of making something new every day to impress her guests. What they found in their dinner and breakfast parcels became less interesting too. Usually it was some chunks of cornbread, 10 or 12 carrot sticks, and a few slimy bits of goat cheese. If they were lucky, there might be a hard-boiled egg. Martha took to mentioning, as if it were a little joke, that even though the Partridges were given extra food from the storehouse because of the extra people, it seemed as if they had less. Wasn't that odd? Dune started to feel hungry a fair amount of time, and he knew others did too. His father never spoke of it, but Edward Pocket griped about the food every evening. I know I'm old and small, he'd say, polishing off the last crumbs of both his dinner and his breakfast, but that doesn't mean I can live on air. One day, Ordney made a disturbing announcement. The cabbage crop, he said, was going to be smaller than expected. Worms had got into it. They'd have only about 2/3 of the cabbage they had last year. After this, not only was the food at lunchtime plainer, but there was less of it. One week they had string beans, last year's pickled cabbage, and goat's milk pudding for lunch 4 days in a row, and when they opened their baskets at dinner time, they found only a bottle of cold potato soup to serve as both dinner and breakfast. Clary had started a garden just a few days after the Emberites arrived at the Pioneer Hotel. She cleared a patch of ground about 40 feet square not far from the riverbank and planted seeds that she had brought from Ember. Children who were too little to go to work in the village helped her pull weeds and fetch buckets of water from the river. Old people sat in the shade giving her advice. After a while, green shoots appeared in rows on the patch of dirt, and Clary was out there every morning and every evening tending them. In several weeks there would be a little extra food for the people of Ember out in their own front yard. But it wouldn't be nearly enough. Some people were already grumbling about their skimpy dinner parcels. One night, when Dune was in room 215 eating with his father and the others, he heard voices in the hall and went out to see a cluster of people a few doors down. Lizzie was there. Dune spotted the red cloud of hair. Tick was there too, his voice carried above the rest. Well, I got 3 carrots, a plum, and a chunk of sour cheese, he said. Lucky me. That ought to keep me going for a while. A few people laughed dryly at this. Dune heard Lizzie giggle. It'll keep you from going for about maybe half an hour, someone said. I don't know how they think we can work with nothing but scraps to eat. Along the hall, other doors opened and other voices joined in. All I got was some limp green beans and a few clumps of porridge. I've had carrot soup 3 days in a row. Some people counseled patience. We shouldn't complain, someone said. It's hard for them to give us food. We should be grateful. I'm tired of being grateful, someone else broke in. They promised to feed us, but they're starving us instead. It seems to me, said Tick, that we should do something about this. I think maybe I'll mention the problem at lunch tomorrow. Maybe we all should. Maybe we should tell them it's very hard to work when you're so hungry. I'll tell them, cried Lizzie's high voice, and other voices rose in agreement. An excited, angry babble filled the hallway, drowning out those who spoke for patience. I'll speak up. We have to protest. Tick is right. Tick for mayor! Someone shouted, laughing. For a second, Tick looked surprised. Then his eyes glowed with pleasure. He raised a fist in the air. We'll stand up for ourselves, he said, and the people around him roared and raised their fists too. Dune turned to his father and Edward and Sage, who had all come to the door to see what was going on. We should tell the Partrons, he said. If we're going to work, we need enough to eat. It's only fair. Of course they don't have to give us anything, said Dune's father. They're giving what they think they can spare. He looked sadly at the dry chunk of cornbread in his hand. But I suppose it can't hurt to mention it, he said. Without being rude, of course. I imagine they're doing the best they can. Mrs. Polster agreed to be the one to bring up the matter. She did so at the lunch the next day. They were having cold spinach soup. I have a request, she said firmly. She set down her soup spoon. Everyone looked towards her. Dune felt a jitter in his stomach. We have noticed, said Mrs. Polster, that the food parcels you are so generously giving us have been considerably smaller lately. We find that when we have eaten what is within, we are still to be frank, hungry. This is a difficulty for us. There was silence. Everyone stared at Mrs. Polster, who sat very calmly with her hands in her lap waiting for the answer. What? Said Martha Partridge at last. Did I hear you right? I believe so, said Mrs. Polster. Unless you have ear trouble, I said we are not getting quite enough to eat. Martha laughed a one-note laugh, a laugh of disbelief. Kinney stopped chewing and looked frightened. Ordany drew himself up and cleared his throat. I am surprised, he said. I thought that you people understood the situation. We do indeed, said Dune's father hastily. We're very grateful for what you've done for us. It's just that we're working quite hard, said Clary. It's a very small amount, said Miss Thorne timidly. For both dinner and breakfast, added Edward Pocket. Last night, said Dune, I had a boiled egg and 3 carrots for dinner, and nothing for breakfast this morning. There was a silence again, a terrible vibrating silence. Then Ordany leaned forward, gripping the edge of the table with his fingertips. Now listen here, he said. We're doing the best we can with what we've been asked to do of us, and I must say a great deal has been asked. Suddenly we're supposed to feed twice as many people as before, more than twice as many. He glared at the Emberite, shifting his eyes to each one in turn. And yet we do not have twice as much food as we did before. It's true that each family is being given a little extra from the storehouse for this emergency, but not much. Sparks Village just does not have enough for 400 extra people. Are we supposed to feed you instead of our families? Why should we? Who are you anyway, you strangers from some city no one's ever heard of? By the end of this speech, Ordany's face was deep with red, and his voice was shaking with rage. Dune felt frozen. All he could think was, he's right, of course, he's right. But we're right, too. Everyone else must have been thinking the same thing. They finished their soup in silence. At the end of the meal, Martha dumped the food parcels on the table instead of handing them out. They each took one, but Dune's father was the only person who said thank you. Later, when Dune opened his parcel, he found a wedge of cabbage leaves turning yellow at the edges and a hunk of some sort of bean cake. His stomach clenched. They're tired of helping us, he thought. What are we going to do?